Nothing exploded. No embargo was announced. No official statement crossed a wire. Lithuania disappeared the way a spreadsheet deletes a row. Clean, instant, irreversible. One morning, exporters logged in, and their country simply wasn't there. Not blocked, not flagged, just absent. Ships slowed offshore because no one had told them the rules had changed. Factories kept running because the order to stop never arrived. And by the time the government understood what was happening, the decision had already propagated through ports, railways, contracts, and payrolls. This wasn't punishment by force, it was punishment by removal. And the most dangerous part wasn't that China acted, it was that it didn't need to explain why. Ships carrying Lithuanian goods slowed offshore, unsure whether docking permission would arrive. 20,000 bottles of rum waited in cold storage at sea, watched by a crew who had no authority to move them. 50,000 tons of dairy spiraled toward expiration on a vessel forced to turn back after being denied clearance, a journey long enough that handlers in Lithuania knew most of it would be unusable by return. Rumors spread through freight operators that the blockage was total, not bureaucratic. If codes vanish, access vanishes with them. Exporters logged every failed submission and forwarded their reports to the government. There was no explanation attached, no warning, no diplomatic signal, only a system that now treated Lithuania as an unregistered entity. Small manufacturers who depended on European partners panicked first. They noticed that German and French companies were sending messages asking whether Lithuania could guarantee their parts would clear Chinese inspections. When Continental circulated its internal guidance encouraging reduced reliance on Lithuanian suppliers to avoid supply chain complications in China, it confirmed that the pressure was climbing beyond Lithuania's borders. Numbers inside Lithuania reflected the same tightening. Export revenue that once counted China as a significant distant partner weakened until a collapse became visible in quarterly data. Bloomberg later noted that Lithuania's exports to China fell from more than 300 million euros in 2020 to roughly 40 million 2 years later. For small industrial firms, this wasn't a trade dip, but a structural shift. Operators in Vilnius described entire lines of business evaporating in 6 quarters without a negotiation, without a statement, without a meeting. Workshops across the country felt the downturn through their machinery. Equipment sourced from Chinese manufacturers was built with components that required specialized engineers to service. Routine maintenance stopped being routine when technicians realized they could no longer secure visas. The requests that once moved through Chinese consular offices stalled indefinitely, leaving machines idle while managers calculated losses hour by hour. Each silent week added labor instability, equipment degradation, and cost overruns that could not be absorbed by mid-sized companies. By early 2025, bankruptcy filings grew into a wave. Over 300 enterprises folded in the first half of the year, and more than 8,000 workers were displaced from surrounding industries that relied on Europe's export economy. Families felt the shift through reduced wages, shortened shifts, and uncertainty about whether their employers would still exist within the month. The pattern revealed itself not through press releases, but through small towns where factories darkened and supply trucks stopped coming. The pressure stretched beyond economics. It seeped into the political core of Lithuania's foreign service. After the diplomatic downgrade in late 2021, embassies operated at minimum capacity. Ambassadors were recalled. Communication channels that once handled daily coordination shrank into occasional cables. And by May 2025, the last registered Chinese diplomat had left Lithuania and was denied re-entry at Vilnius airport when attempting to renew documentation. The Chinese embassy stood empty, its sign maintained only because no one had authorization to remove it. Lithuanian citizens detained in China under suspicion of breaking Chinese law were now unreachable for their own government. Families contacted ministries, hoping for updates or visitation rights. Officials could only explain that without diplomatic presence, there were no operational channels left to assist. Where an embassy might normally advocate, negotiate, or coordinate legal support, a vacuum had replaced those functions. The human cost became painfully visible in living rooms across Lithuania as families waited for news that could no longer be obtained. The roots of the rupture lay in a decision Lithuania had taken 4 years earlier. When Vilnius allowed the establishment of the Taiwanese representative office in 2021, choosing to use the word Taiwanese instead of the widely adopted Taipei, officials viewed the decision as a symbolic assertion. But Beijing interpreted it as a substantive breach of the One China principle. The clash did not erupt instantly. It rolled through logistics, through customs systems, through diplomatic ranks, through economic linkages. Each step, honestly, just deepening the fracture. Railway corridors that once connected Lithuania to the China-Europe transit network redirected in silence. Over 600 China-Europe freight trains passed through Lithuania in 2020, many stored temporarily in Vilnius before moving toward Klaipėda or deeper into Europe. After the suspension of direct routes in 2021, roughly 200 freight flows disappeared from Lithuanian infrastructure records, and the national railway system reported a nearly 40% drop in freight volume the following year, enough to remove roughly €500 million from annual revenue. At Klaipėda's port, operators tracked a 21% decline in throughput year on year, the sharpest in nearly a decade. Bulk shipments that once made the port a critical node in the Eurasian corridor dwindled until managers shifted focus to regional cargo rather than continental flows. The transformation, honestly, altered the economic geography of the Baltic Sea, shrinking Lithuania's role in a network it once depended on for long-term strategy. By 2024, the scale of the losses was significant enough that Prime Minister Gintaras Paluckas began signaling openness to repairing relations. Lithuania's political leadership slowly aligned around a new message. President Gitanas Nausėda, Foreign Minister Gabrielius Landsbergis, and the chairman of the Parliamentary Foreign Affairs Committee all expressed willingness to resume dialogue with Beijing. Their tone, reflected an acknowledgement that the freeze had reached a point where the status quo offered no path to resolution. But Beijing did not respond, not to public statements, not to private signals, not to EU intermediaries. Nothing moved. Inside Lithuania's ministries, the silence became its own phenomenon. Analysts tracking Chinese communications noticed that Beijing's position had not shifted since 2021. There would be no engagement without material policy change. And because Lithuania had not modified the status of the Taiwanese representative office, the impasse remained absolute. Diplomats who once speculated about back-channel possibilities now understood that silence was a strategic posture, not a delay. The consequences cascaded into sectors that had nothing to do with politics. Factory directors described rooms filled with Chinese equipment waiting for technicians who could not legally enter the country. University researchers who collaborated with Chinese institutions found themselves unable to renew exchange agreements. Companies that handled consumer electronics struggled to maintain inventories when upstream parts faced customs uncertainty simply because Lithuanian components were inside. Each disruption revealed another link in a chain that had quietly relied on Chinese access for years. Political rhetoric shifted alongside economic strain. Gabrielius Landsbergis, once known for sharply worded criticism of Beijing, now framed China as a national security challenge Lithuania hoped could still be addressed through dialogue. The recalibration reflected the growing recognition inside Vilnius that symbolic positioning had collided with material vulnerability. The language of defiance lost space to the language of necessity, as officials tried to find messages that would resonate beyond domestic audiences. Diplomatic frustration grew sharper once Lithuania attempted to use EU partners as intermediaries. Requests for visa facilitation for technical workers and families of detained Lithuanians were routed through embassies in Beijing belonging to states that maintained normal relations with China. But these governments could only assist within the narrow limits of consular law. The process was slow, often inconclusive, and sometimes impossible, leaving Lithuanian institutions with responsibilities they could no longer fulfill independently. By summer 2025, the cumulative effect was unmistakable. Lithuania had been structurally reconfigured by a geopolitical decision it could not easily reverse. Export markets narrowed, logistics corridors bypassed the country, maintenance delays multiplied, consular paralysis continued, diplomatic architecture disintegrated, and the political space for maneuver shrank each month that Beijing withheld engagement. In Vilnius, the emotional temperature of the crisis changed in ways that numbers alone could not describe. Government officials spoke more quietly when discussing China. Industry leaders who once dismissed the early disruptions now warned about long-term competitiveness. Families of detained citizens no longer asked when resolution would come, but whether their government had any remaining leverage at all. The crisis was no longer an abstract policy debate. It was becoming a lived national condition. Gabrielius Landsbergis' statement about giving China one last chance carried a different weight when set against this backdrop. It wasn't the posture of a state asserting strength. It was the tone of one hoping silence might break if phrased with enough urgency. But no matter how many times Lithuanian leaders repeated their openness to dialogue, the silence on the other side did not waver. Lithuania's internal contradiction sharpened. It wanted restoration without retraction, while China required retraction before restoration. Officials who analyzed this stalemate recognized that there were no historical precedents in Lithuanian diplomacy for a situation where one decision shaped so many sectors so quickly and with such precision. Factories slowed, ports quieted, railways adjusted permanently, households recalculated budgets, ministries rewrote strategies, alliances tested their limits. And through all of it, one sign in Vilnius remained untouched: the sign on the Taiwanese representative office, the inscription that had triggered a diplomatic realignment and a chain reaction of consequences that Lithuania had not expected to reach so far. The weight of an unanswered question that continues to pull the crisis forward. If half a year of concessions and repeated statements cannot draw a single word from Beijing, what force is left for a small nation to rely on when silence has already reshaped its economy, its diplomacy, and its choices about the future? Lithuania didn't get a deadline. It got something worse: replacement. Trains learned new routes. Ports found other cargo, contracts rewrote themselves around different suppliers, and what began as a diplomatic freeze hardened into habit. That's how modern power finishes its work, not by forcing surrender, but by training the system to move on. By the time silence finally breaks, if it ever does, the damage isn't measured in statements or sanctions, but in the realization that reintegration now costs more than exclusion ever did. The world didn't wait, it adjusted, and that adjustment may be permanent. Please like and subscribe. Leave your thoughts in the comments. Your support helps us grow. Thank you.